Picture yourself standing in the doorway of a longhouse, somewhere in the cold Norse lands, in the year 950. The wind coming off the fjord is sharp enough to sting your face, and you're about to get dressed for the day. Now, before you take a single step, close your eyes and picture a Viking. Go on. Almost certainly, without even meaning to, you have just placed a helmet on his head with two great curving horns rising from the sides. And that single picture, the one that nearly every person alive carries around in their mind, is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Completely, provably, almost comically wrong. No Viking ever wore a horned helmet into battle. Not one. There is not a single reliable example of one anywhere in the archaeology of the entire Norse world. The horns were bolted onto the Vikings almost 900 years after the last longship had rotted away, by a man with a needle, a stage and a theatre to fill. So let us do something far better than the cartoon. Let us actually get you dressed, layer by layer, in the real clothing of a real Norse person. And by the end of it, you will not only know exactly what the Vikings truly wore, you will know precisely where those horns came from, and why they simply refused to go away. Start against the skin, because that is where a Viking's mourning really began. The very first thing you pull on is not wool, it is linen, a long undershirt called the serk, spun and woven from the fibres of the flax plant, cool and smooth where wool would scratch and itch, and far easier to wash. And this is not a guess. In the graves at Birka, the great trading town on its island in a chilly Swedish lake, archaeologists uncovered the remains of these linen shifts over and over again, sometimes as nothing more than a ghostly imprint pressed into the back of a corroded brooch, sometimes as fragile surviving scraps of the cloth itself. Linen sits directly against the body, soaks up the sweat and the day's grime, and can be boiled and scrubbed and bleached pale and clean again, while the heavier wool worn on top stays dry and warm. And here is a small, deeply human surprise hiding in the evidence. In parts of western Norway, textiles from this hidden underlayer were dyed blue using woad. People were colouring their underwear, not to show it off, since no one else would ever see it, but simply because they could, and because they liked it that way. That one quiet detail tells you these were not grim, ragged wretches shivering in sackcloth. They cared, right down to the very layer that nobody but themselves would ever glimpse. Over the linen goes the wool, and wool is the true fabric of the Viking world. If you are a man, you drop a tunic over your head, the kirtle, a long-sleeved garment falling to somewhere between the hip and the knee, and you belt it at the waist. On your legs go woolen trousers, cut in a surprising range of styles, from narrow and close-fitting to baggy, gathered breeches that ballooned out at the knee. A leather belt cinches the tunic in and carries the tools of your day, a knife almost always, a small pouch, a whetstone, a comb tucked in its case. There are no zips, no buttons as we would know them, no elastic anywhere. Everything is tied, wrapped, laced, pinned, or held closed with a brooch. And the wool itself is not the soft, fluffy stuff of a modern jumper. It is a dense, hard-wearing cloth the Norse called wadmal, woven so tightly that it could turn away wind and rain, so tough and so valuable that in Iceland it was used quite literally as money, a standard length of it counted out to settle a debt or pay a fine. Sit with that for a moment. The very cloth on your back could be spent like silver. Nobody who thinks of clothing that way treats it as something to throw away. If you are a woman, then over that same linen underdress you wear one of the most instantly recognizable garments of the whole age, the apron-dress, sometimes called the smoker. It is a panel of fine wool, wrapped around the body and suspended from the shoulders by a pair of straps, and those straps are fastened at the chest by two brooches, one on each side. These are the famous oval brooches, domed ovals of cast bronze, often worked with beautiful gripping beast patterns and sometimes gilded, roughly the size and shape of a tortoise shell, which is exactly why archaeologists nickname them tortoise brooches. They are so common and so distinctly a woman's ornament that when a grave contains a matched pair of them, we can usually say with real confidence, "Here lies a Norse woman," and they handed us something priceless. As the bronze slowly corroded in the earth, it preserved the very threads pressed against it, so that from these brooches we have recovered the linen loops of the straps and fragments of the wool and linen they once held, the closest we will ever come to actually touching a Viking wardrobe. Between the two brooches, many women hung a festoon, a swooping string of beads, glass and amber and rock crystal, some of them traded from almost unimaginable distances, and often a few small useful things as well: a needle case, a little knife, a key, dangling openly where a hand could reach them. A Norse woman's chest was, in a sense, both her jewellery box and her toolkit, worn out in the open and with obvious pride. Now the weather turns, as it always does in the north, and you reach for the outer layer, the cloak. It is a rectangle or half-oval of thick wool, sometimes lined, sometimes doubled over for warmth, thrown across the shoulders and, crucially, fastened not in the centre of the chest, but at one shoulder, usually the right. Why the right? Because the cloak had to leave your sword arm and your working arm completely free. To pin it, you used a brooch, and those brooches were themselves loud statements. A humble farmer might close his cloak with a simple bent pin of iron. A wealthy trader or a chieftain fastened his with a great ring brooch of silver, a penannular brooch with a long, wicked pin that could double at need as a tool or even a weapon. Some of these pins are so long, a foot or more, that they were plainly about display far more than function. In Norse custom, the way a person fastened their cloak announced, silently and instantly, exactly where they stood in the world. On your feet go shoes of leather, and they are cleverer than you might expect. These are turnshoes, stitched together inside out and then turned right way round, so that the seams end up sitting protected on the inside, while the smooth grain of the hide faces out to meet the mud and the wet. They are low, soft, close-fitting things, closer to a modern moccasin than to a heavy boot, fastened with a leather thong or a toggle around the ankle, and when the thin sole wore through, as it very quickly did, it was simply cut away and a fresh one stitched on. Inside the shoes, against the biting cold, you wore socks, but not knitted ones, because knitting as we know it had not yet reached the north. Instead, the Norse used a slower, older craft called nail binding, needle binding, in which a single blunt needle loops the wool through itself again and again to build up a dense, stretchy, astonishingly warm fabric. From the frozen ground of Viking-age towns we have pulled genuine knoll-binding socks and mittens, a 1,000-year-old defence against a 1,000-year-old winter, made stitch by patient stitch by someone who cared about the person who would wear them. So what did all of this actually look like? Not, whatever the films may tell you, an endless sea of undyed brown and grey, though plenty of ordinary working clothes were exactly that, the natural shades of the sheep left right there in the wool. But the Norse loved colour, and they knew very well how to make it. From the root of the madder plant they drew a strong, warm red, from the leaves of woad a deep and lasting blue, from weld and other plants clear bright yellows, and by layering one dye over another, greens, walnut husks and lichens gave them every shade of brown and tan. And colour was a language of wealth. A good, bright, colour-fast red from imported madder was expensive, the dye carried in from far away and the cloth heavy with labour to prepare. So a rich red garment quietly shouted status the way a fine tailored coat does today. The very finest clothes were finished at the collar and the cuffs with woven bands of silk and threads of real gold and silver, silk that had travelled the entire length of the known world, down the rivers of the Rus from Byzantium and further still, only to end up trimming the sleeve of a Norse noblewoman standing in the falling snow. These were people who dressed to be seen, and who read one another's clothing as fluently as we read a brand today, and every single thread of it was made by hand, which is perhaps the hardest thing of all for us to truly feel. There were no machines, no bolts of finished cloth waiting on a shelf. Someone had to shear the sheep, wash and comb the raw wool, and then spin it, hour upon endless hour, on a hand-turned spindle, spinning while walking, while sitting, while talking, spinning almost constantly, because it took a genuinely staggering amount of spun thread just to make cloth. Then it was woven, standing upright, on a warp-weighted loom leaning against the wall of the longhouse, the warp threads hanging down from a beam and pulled taut by rows of clay or stone weights. To clothe one single family for one single year was a colossal, unending labour, and to make the one great woolen sail for one ship could swallow the wool of hundreds of sheep and years of a woman's work. Once you understand that, you finally understand why a tunic was mended and mended again, handed down through a family, written into a will, and never ever simply thrown away. Clothing was not fashion that came and went with a season, it was wealth, and you wore it on your back. Which brings us at last back up to the head and to those horns. Let us begin with the plainest truth of all. Most Vikings, most of the time, wore no helmet whatsoever. A helmet was a costly, specialist piece of war gear, and for everyday life in a farming or trading town, it would have been as out of place as a full suit of armor at the breakfast table. What a Norse person actually wore on their head was ordinary and warm, a simple cap of wool or leather, and for a woman, very often a headscarf or a linen cloth drawn over the hair. And when a warrior did march to battle properly protected, what did that protection actually look like? For that we have exactly one answer. In 1943, on a farm called Gjermundbu in Norway, a man clearing a field struck iron, and up out of the ground came the only complete Viking Age helmet ever found in the whole of Scandinavia. One in 2 centuries of digging up Norse graves. Painstakingly restored from 9 rusted fragments, it is a rounded cap made of 4 riveted iron plates, with a small spike at the crown, a curtain of chainmail to guard the neck, and across the eyes and nose, a striking spectacle-shaped guard, a half-mask of iron. It is grim, practical, and quietly beautiful. And it has no horns, none, nowhere, because of course it doesn't. Horns on a war helmet would be a gift to your enemy, a handle to catch a blade or wrench your head sideways, a piece of suicidal theatre that no fighting man on earth would ever tolerate. The real Viking helmet is the plain iron dome of Gjermundbu, and the real Viking, far more often than not, went bareheaded or simply capped in wool. So where then did the horns actually come from? They came from a stage. In the year 1876, in the German town of Bayreuth, the composer Richard Wagner unveiled the first complete performance of his vast operatic cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, 4 long evenings of gods, heroes, and doomed Norse-flavoured myth. To dress this whole imagined world, Wagner employed a costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler, and Doppler faced a very practical problem. He needed his singers, seen from the very back rows of a darkened theatre by flickering gaslight, to read instantly as ancient, wild, otherworldly northern warriors. A plain iron cap would simply vanish into the gloom. So he reached for drama. He crowned some of his warriors with horned helmets, and he gave his warrior women, the Valkyries, sweeping wings. From the cheap seats, in silhouette, it was electrifying. It looked exactly like the fierce, untamed, heroic past that 19th century audiences, intoxicated with national romanticism and dreams of a glorious ancestral North, were absolutely desperate to see. And it stuck. It stuck like almost nothing in the entire history of costume has ever stuck. Now, in fairness, Doppler did not conjure the shape out of nothing. Deep in the Scandinavian Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years before the very first Viking longship ever touched the water, people really did craft horned helmets, strange and splendid ceremonial pieces made for ritual and display, and never once for war. Those horns had already been drifting through the imaginations of artists for a while, but it was Wagner's stage, and the flood of operas and paintings and illustrated books that followed in its wake that fused the horns permanently onto the Viking in the popular mind. From there the image marched outward, unstoppable, into cartoons, into comic strips, onto the sides of Halloween costumes, even onto the helmet of a professional American football team, until the horned Viking had become one of the most recognizable and one of the least accurate images in all of human history. A costume designer's clever flourish, mistaken by the entire world for a fact. And that is the quiet joke sitting at the very heart of all this. The single most famous thing about the Vikings, the horns, is the one thing they never actually had. Strip them away, and what stands before you is far stranger and far more real. A person in a linen shirt dyed blue for no one's eyes but their own. A woman with tortoise-shell brooches of bronze at her shoulders and a rope of amber and glass swinging bright between them. A man with a long silver pin at his shoulder announcing his rank without a single word. Feet in soft leather turnshoes and warm, needle-bound socks. A body wrapped in wool so precious it was spent like silver and inherited like land. These were people who dressed with care, with meaning, and with real pride, in garments that cost a staggering amount of human labour to make, and that told anyone who cared to look exactly who they were. So the next time that horned figure comes lumbering across a screen, you will know the truth. The helmet is a lie borrowed from an opera house, but the real Viking, the one in dyed wool and bright brooches and carefully mended linen, standing in the doorway of a longhouse against the cold, is somehow far more impressive for being real, because these people were never a costume. They were craft workers and farmers and traders who spun their own cloth by firelight and wore their whole world's wealth upon their backs. And not one of them, Not on any single day, in any battle, in any grave we have ever opened, ever once put on a pair of horns. So here is what we would genuinely love to hear from you. Which of these surprised you the most? The blue underwear worn for no one to see, the wool that was spent like money, or the fact that the horned helmet was invented for a stage in 1876? Tell us in the comments below, because the people of the past are almost never who the legends say they were, and the truth, once you gently brush the myth away, turns out very nearly always to be the better story.